Hello, Esther here. As you know, I had former Chancellor Lord Lamont on the podcast this week talking about how he'd boost the economy post-COVID-19 with a focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. He also talked about how he dealt with the economic shock in the 1980s of leaving the ERM. Well, there was so much to say that I couldn't squeeze it into that podcast, so I've made this podcast extra. So if you'd like to hear that full, unedited interview, listen now. Norman, what did you think of Boris's build, build, build speech?
Well, it was a speech very much in accordance with what he's always made clear he wanted to do. It wasn't surprising. He has always said that part of what he wants to do as a prime minister is, in his language, to level up. That is to bring increased prosperity to the industrial regions of his country, in the Midlands and in the North, which have been left behind, which have suffered from deindustrialization as industry has moved to the Far East and other parts of the globe. And this is a problem which is common to most advanced countries in Europe and in the United States, but it's never really been tackled. And infrastructure, housing, transport, water, all these areas are ones in which the government can help to share prosperity throughout the country. And, in that sense, it wasn't surprising what he said. Some people criticized the speech on the grounds that there wasn't a lot of new money. People love this phrase, new money, old money. But I saw it just as an interim statement. We're about to get a statement from the Chancellor next week, and he will no doubt fill in more details. So this wasn't the final definitive plan for the recovery. It was just saying we're going to do a lot of construction, a lot of building in order to level up, share prosperity and create some jobs.
And that's how I saw the speech, actually. After a period that we've all been through in lockdown and COVID, it was resetting the vision of this Conservative Party. As somebody who is a northerner, represents a sort of northern area, this levelling up is key. Things that we would see we don't have, whether it is transport or digital infrastructure. How do we allow opportunities for all? How do we invigorate parts of the country to get business going? So I saw it very much along that line too. But I guess what some people won't quite understand, in 2010, we made it very clear as Conservatives, you can't spend yourself out of debt. But here we are in 2020, and after COVID, we've got an even bigger debt. How are we now saying we can spend our way out of debt?
Well, I think the situation is very different from 2008. There's two aspects to it. First of all, with COVID coming along and causing havoc, we have absolutely no alternative but to safeguard the jobs of people that haven't gone because these firms are inefficient or haven't gone because of some economic cycle downwards. They've gone because the government itself decided to close parts of the economy down in order to deal with a public health emergency. So things like the furlough scheme, paying people's wages while they're not actually working, that is something that had to be done because the government created this situation. And that will have to be paid for over the longer term. Infrastructure, of course, is designed to improve the performance of the economy and, in a sense, help to pay for itself. But there's another factor that makes the situation different, which is interest rates are now at an extraordinarily low level post-war, that is, anyway, an extraordinarily low level for any period since the war. And in some cases, interest rates are actually negative. That is to say, governments are being paid to borrow. So it isn't just the totality of debt that matters. It is the interest that you pay on the debt. And if the interest is very little, almost zero, or indeed negative, you're being paid to borrow, then obviously it's a good idea to invest in projects that yield a return and raise the growth and give a dividend to the economy as a whole. This doesn't mean that we can just borrow forever regardless, because, of course, even with interest, without interest, you have to repay the principal of a loan. So I think it means we've got more headroom, but it doesn't mean that there's a magic money tree or we can just spend whatever we like. There's got still to be discipline.
So am I right?
Wait, can I just...
Oh, yes.
People say, this shows that austerity before was a mistake. No, it doesn't, because the conditions were different. We had to pay a higher interest rate then than now. The difference is the very low interest rate. And it was the fact that the Conservative government dealt with the debt that we had before that leaves us in a strong position now. And I guess what will happen is borrowing will go up for the next few years, but, eventually we will have to repay some of it, but we can repay it over a longer period.
To me, austerity meant living within your means, and that was what we were trying to do within 2010, wasn't it? Just living within our means, which we weren't doing.
Dead right. Austerity, you would think, implied that public spending was being reduced. Public spending might have been reduced in some particular areas, but overall it was just continuing to go up and up. So a man from Mars might say, what austerity? But austerity is perhaps not a good word. I know Boris often says he doesn't like the word austerity. Living within our means, as you put it, is the right way to look at it.
And that, as you said, is what we'll be continuing to doing. But this is, and I think many business I've spoken to have described the situation more akin to a war than it was the financial crash.
That's true. But of course, I think one has to be careful in some ways when people say, we'll pay for this just as we paid for the war. The war actually bankrupted Britain and changed us from being a creditor nation into being a debtor nation. So, I think one's got to be careful with that analogy. But I think the key point is the cost of debt. The interest rate is quite different now. We're living through extraordinary times. Of course, it might not remain that way forever. Interest rates might rise again, which is, again, why you've got to be careful.
Absolutely. But if you were the Chancellor at this moment, you see sense in the action that's being taken, and it would be something that you would have done, mindful of all of these things that you're reminding us of, negative interest rates, how long they will remain low, and what you're paying back and when you're paying it back.
Yes, absolutely. I think in the next few years, in the short term, you've just got to let borrowing take the strain, and I would not put up taxes, because I think if you put up taxes, you would stifle the recovery, and it may take a couple of years before the recovery's really got going.
And that is something people are calling for, not you, not I, but people will say, how are we paying this back? If we're spending more, we'll have to tax more. But you would be on the side of what? A stimulation to the economy, low taxing for this period in time?
Yeah, I would be, the stimulus is coming from the borrowing, and I would let the borrowing rise in the short term, and then we can look at things further down the line. But I wouldn't be in favor of putting up taxes, even if it became necessary in the longer run. I think it would be vital not to do it in the immediate future, because it would just stop the recovery taking place. But I would let borrowing take the strain and then look at things in a few years' time.
Now, I'm going to ask you, because very few people have been Chancellor of the country. You have. And you were there at a time when there was another economic shock, and this was as we left the ERM. And I just wonder what it's like as an individual who is the Chancellor, personally, the toll it takes on you and how you keep going. I mean, what was it like at that period? I mean, what will Rishi be going through?
Well, I think, just to answer the second part first, I think Rishi Sunak, who I have great admiration for, I think he's acted boldly and quickly, but I think and therefore deserves all the plaudits and praise he's getting. But of course, the difficult part is still to come. I'm afraid we're going to see job losses. We're going to see unemployment rise, and that will make it much more tough for the Chancellor rather than just signing checks for the furlough scheme. So the challenging period is really ahead for him. I think one's got to just get on with the job and be indifferent to some of the ill-considered criticism that can be made. People often ask me about the exit from the ERM and what did I feel like? And I always say, well, I didn't sit around asking myself, what do I feel? I just, I thought this is a great emergency. This, Lamont, is what you're here for. You're here to deal with it. You must deal with it as best you can and as best the government can, and you get on with it. And you only reflect on it after it's all over. I personally, time of leaving the ERM, that was the government's policy. I did my best to sustain it. As it became apparent, I didn't regard it as a complete disaster because I felt our membership of the ERM had delivered certain benefits, low inflation, which had come down dramatically. But once it had done that, I was quite not unhappy that we were forced out, even though I tried to resist it because it was the government's policy. So, I was in the position where I was being humiliated because the government's policy had been reversed, but I quite approved privately of the reversal of the policy.
And that's a difficult thing to be when you've got collective responsibility, you're delivering what it is you were there to do, and yet at the same time you can see, the inevitability, and you're going to deliver that as well. And I don't think you ever get the credit for that, seeing both sides, do you? I think the media and the spotlight is quite brutal.
I think that's right. I mean, I often say about the ERM that I don't think it did the harm that people think, because we had to have a tough time. Inflation when I became Chancellor was nearly 12%. When I left, it was heading towards 2%. Now, that had to happen. But after it had happened, then the ERM was no longer necessary. And so I've often said the ERM was like a tool in my hands which disintegrated once it had done its job. And the government's policy was then reversed. And of course that, made me look very, very foolish. But it didn't actually do anyone any harm.
And then people at the moment, a lot of the spotlight is on how, cabinet ministers work with civil servants, how they do their job. When you were there, that would have been a key bit, really, of keeping morale up, getting people to deliver what you were saying, going in this sort of direction. It would have been a really tough, turbulent time. What was that relationship like there? How did you manage to muster the energy and the direction to lead a whole set of people?
Well, I found the civil service in the Treasury very professional, very good. And when I resigned from the government and made a resignation speech, one of the things I was very careful to say, and I meant, I said that any criticism of my time as Chancellor should be directed at me and never at officials, because I was very well served by officials and I had absolutely no criticism. I think there are certain reforms that need to be made in the civil service. There's not always a lot of accountability for an individual civil servant. He may do something well or badly and then he moves to another job. I think there is a need to look at what an individual achieves. And also it's quite difficult to get rid of an inadequate civil servant. I think our civil servants are brilliant on the whole, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to get rid of an inadequate one. And that is very difficult to do. So I think there are certain reforms that are needed, but I don't like the atmosphere that there is of hostility as portrayed in the press between government and civil servants. I think you've got to have the two sing from the same hymn sheet.
I wonder if added to the complications is that people don't remain in a job so long now. What the average length of job is something like 2 to 4 years or something. People might have 11 different jobs over a lifetime. And I wonder if that adds to the problem. Just as you're getting to know the job, you're moving off.
I think there's something in that, but that criticism can be applied to politicians as much as civil servants.
What, because our general elections are coming now every 2 years rather than 5?
Well, no, I mean, people do. I mean, look at the number of ministers of transport. I lose count. Ministers are reshuffled all the time.
You hit on another issue there, which is the job situation coming forward. And I think that has got something, we've got to keep our eye on that. And what incentives could we bring to employers to keep a hold of their staff? What do you think we could do as a Conservative government to support, businesses?
Well, I think this is the absolutely key priority. Rishi Sunak's mind should be on jobs, jobs, and jobs. And I'll be looking forward to his speech next week. I think it would probably be difficult to roll the furlough scheme forward more. I may be wrong in that, but I think it's just too expensive to do that. And also, I think if you just extend the furlough scheme indefinitely, you might be encouraging employers to put on furlough people who they would have kept anyway. There's a danger of that. But I think the way to deal with it is probably to cut the cost of employing people. And I would perhaps have a holiday for employers' national insurance for a period of time. If you can cut the cost of employing people, that is the best way to retain jobs. And although there'll be a lot of emphasis, I'm sure, in what the Chancellor says on new jobs in new industries, we've got to remember the existing jobs in existing firms. I mean, firms are going out of business, not through any fault of their own. They're going out of business because the government, quite inevitably and rightly, because of a public health emergency, decided to impose regulations and close certain sectors down. So, poor restaurant, a man who owns a restaurant or a woman who owns a restaurant and suddenly finds they can only have half the number of customers that they used to have, that isn't their fault. And I think if you just made it easier to employ people, that would be the right thing to do. Another thing that could be considered is a temporary cut in VAT to bring forward spending. But that is very, very expensive. And, the marginal adjustment in the cost of something might not really generate a lot of job retention. So I would favour cutting the cost of employing people.
And then maybe paying for training schemes, some form of adaptation.
Yes, of course. Yes, you've got to do something for the school leavers, apprenticeships.
Definitely the training and the support. And as we know, if people are online, their businesses are doing better. So I think this investment in sort of digital infrastructure and high-speed broadband for everybody is key. And that's when, Boris said, build, build, build. He said jobs, jobs, jobs. And the other thing he focused on was this project speed, as it were, and how fast and nimble we need to be. Working with the civil servants, were you ever aware of this project speed? Did you find it a speedy place, or do you think this is going to be the obstacle that maybe he comes across, getting it done speedily when A, we are a democracy, and B, we have to go through all kinds of legal checks, judicial reviews, etc., etc.? Is that going to be the stumbling block for us?
Well, I think with infrastructure and building, you're right. I mean, you have the problem of planning, and I lose count of the number of times that ministers of housing have said they're going to ease the planning laws to make it easier to build houses. It seems to happen repeatedly, and yet it never really happens. But that is something that will be very important for infrastructure projects. I mean, just look at the arguments. They've been over Heathrow, and having another runway there has gone on forever. If we really want to have big, successful projects, we've got to find a way of reaching a consensus and cutting through some of the planning objections in the past. So that's one thing. The second thing, of course, is you've got to have the manpower and you've got to have the skills. And, I don't think we can just have an infrastructure revolution without training a lot of other people, a lot of new people as well.
And I remember being obviously in the government 2010 to 15. I was also aware that you can't go off in every direction thinking that you can do multiple projects. In the end, you did streamline it back to a couple to have A, the oversight, B, as you say, the people, C, get through all the legals on that. So I know for me, the big one for me would be this digital infrastructure, would be connecting everybody up. So I myself would prioritise that over, well, in fact, I'd get rid of high speed too. I would do the east to west up north and all local transport plans, but I would never do high speed 2, which to me seems to be a form of transport that won't be delivered till well after its expiry date.
Yes, I agree with that. It won't have a big impact on the present situation. I've always been a bit skeptical of the so-called benefits of HS2, which seem to be based to some extent on surveys of how people spend their time and very marginal savings of time. I don't really believe have a huge economic benefit.
Yeah, well, we're absolutely coming from the same place there. So I think, as I said, it'll be focusing on what we can do. So looking forward to next week, Rishi's going to give a statement there. Is there anything that you would be looking for, any specific measures you would like to see in that statement?
Well, I want to see the emphasis on the cost of jobs, and I hope he'll do something on national insurance. I think that would be the best thing to do.
And closing different cities down, which we might be doing now. Well, we've done to Leicester, could happen in other places. I'm just concerned if we're wanting to level up, that automatically levels down places. And I'm just very concerned about this notion of shutting areas down.
Yes, but it's a lot better than closing large areas down, just smaller areas. I think it's inevitable with testing and tracing that we will see some local lockdowns. Hope they won't necessarily be as large as closing whole cities, maybe bits of cities or a meat processing factory, something like that. But I think it's inevitable. I mean, we've seen it in other countries. You see it in Germany now. You can see it in Korea. You do get selective lockdowns. I mean, parts of Seoul have been closed down, even though they were very successful in dealing with the virus. I agree it has very negative connotations for getting out of this crisis.
And do you think this is the new normal going forward, to understand there could be area lockdowns, to understand?
No, I hate that phrase, the new normal.
Well, you can give me a new phrase then for what is it? It is just the current being or something.
In the Lamont household, the words new normal are not permitted. I mean, I read in a newspaper an article saying, will we ever shake hands again? And then I read in a French newspaper, people were saying, will we ever be allowed to kiss again? I mean...
Well, I hope so.
I don't accept that behaviour is going to change. I'm not going to go into restaurants forever and have a glass panel around me. I think obviously these rather, to my mind, pettifogging, annoying restrictions are necessary, but no way should they be allowed to become semi-permanent. And I don't feel comfortable when I hear Conservative ministers saying how many people you can meet and where you can stay on a Saturday night. This is not the real business of government. It's necessary for public health reasons in the very short term, but it's against all human nature to have regulations of this kind, and we must set the people free.
Oh, well, look, Norman, you've been a superstar. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that I managed to pin you down because you're so otherwise busy. So thank you so much.
No, it was lovely. Thank you.